I'm going to show you a black opening setup that destroys players below 2,200 when they play 1e4. And the beauty of this setup is it can be played by a lot of different move orders. Let me just show you the basic setup first. So we play d5, we bring our queen to d5 whenever, knight c3, queen a5. And this system, by the way, I've been playing this quite a lot in the last year and even before that. And we're getting some really great results against my opponents. Let's just say they go knight f3. We then bring our knight out to c6, attacking the center. Let's say they play bishop c4. Or they can play bishop d2, it also works. But we then go bishop to g4. And in just a few moves, we have already managed to line up all of our pieces for a big attack on the d4 pawn. It makes the system very easy to remember because you're putting the pieces on the same squares pretty much every time, developing the queen side first, and then if they try to defend their pawn, we play e5 and we just throw everything at that d4 pawn, making it very hard for white already to avoid the loss of a pawn, because they also have to worry about moves like e4, they also have to worry about the pin on the pawn to the queen. We're going to go into a lot more details, but if you are enjoying the video, do make sure to leave a like and also subscribe in case you are new to the channel. And with that out of the way, let's see some games where I destroyed various players below 2,200 with the sub that I've just shown you. So going back to the beginning, the most common way to get this set up is via the Scandinavian defense. So queen takes d5. I'll show you a bit later on how to play it via knight f6 as well, just for a bit of variety. But I remember that actually a lot of Australian players, in fact, in my time, have used subs similar to this one very successfully. I can think of, for example, I am Vladimir Smirnov and Canet Master Blair Mandler. Those two players have played this system very effectively just to crush players below 2,200 in Blitz. It's why I originally picked up the idea, but it's only recently that I started to revisit it. So let's say they played a move of bishop d2, for example, trying to break that pin on the queen. Once again, we play the move knight to c6. You could also start with bishop g4 if you want to. I kind of explain how that works. In my course, play the Strongest Scandinavian 2025, which I'll put a link to in the description below. But for now, I just want to get you started, just show you how I won various games, so you can see what the most common mistakes are that your opponents will make, so that you can then punish them. So after knight f3, we play the move bishop g4. We put the pin on the knight and attack the pawn indirectly. Now, it is worth pointing out, just for the sake of objectivity, that if you are playing against players above 2,200, this system is not 100% sound from a computer point of view. So it does mean if your opponent is fully prepared, they will get a very good position. But in my experience, there are actually no opponents below 2,200 who are really ready for this sideline. So after bishop e2, long castles. In the game I have here, two of my opponents actually played castle short against me. But that's obviously a move that we're very happy to see, because after bishop takes f3 and knight takes d4, we do just win a pawn in this position. So we achieved our strategy of destroying the white center by developing queenside first and then removing the defenders of their pawn. And the rest of the game I'll just show very briefly, but yeah, my opponent basically just ended up being a pawn down with a very unsafe king, and was able to even deliver a nice little checkmate here at the end, where I found this cool move of rook takes d2, so that after takes and rook g8, they resigned rather than allowing the rook takes g5 checkmate. I mean, in how many other systems can you literally checkmate your opponent in 16 moves, you know? And this guy was rated 1904 bullet on chess.com, so that's already going to be, quite a bit higher rated than probably, most of you are who are watching this, but it shows you what's possible when you follow such a powerful attacking system like the one I've just shown you here. Now, what if they do try to defend that d4 pawn? Well, I did have an opponent rated 2000, Nico Kui, who played the best move of knight to b5 in this position. It is a move you do have to watch out for, that your queen can come under some danger. If this is something that you want to avoid, I will show you another way to play it, where your queen ends up a lot safer in another line, but let's show this one first. So here my opponent already had to find a difficult move in order to keep an advantage. The move they had to find here is the somewhat surprising knight g5. Only this move would allow white to keep an edge by attacking the pawn f7. But my opponent didn't find this. Instead, he played the move of c3, a natural enough move to defend the pawn on d4, but actually a big mistake, because now after bishop f3, their pieces are overloaded. If they go gf3, well, we play the move e5, and we just rip open the center. We're just getting at the soft underbelly, getting at the white king. And we're only 2 moves away from having full development and a very strong initiative. I mean, if you love to attack, this is the perfect opening for you to play. But instead, my opponent played bishop f3, and he didn't realize he was just leaving the knight on pre. And I did go on to win from this position, went on to convert an endgame with an extra piece into victory. So as we can see here, white really has a bit of a hard time. With bishop e3, they run into e5. That should be e5, of course. And already white just doesn't really have a good way to avoid a loss for pawn. They can't move the knight because this is pinned. But yeah, they're just having a really, really hard time. Like if castles, we can actually even take and actually let them take on bishop c6. Because as I kind of show in my course as well, I also show this variation there, that after bishop d4, c5, we do just pin and win the bishop. Because if the bishop moves, then the queen will be taken. So again, just using some standard tricks, you'll notice it's very often we're just kind of playing the same tactical ideas like long castles e5 against almost anything that white does. We make our life easy and we make their life really hard. So they can play other moves as well. If they play bishop e3. I remember having this in a game actually against another 2000 player, and it's kind of the same idea we just saw, that we've got the fork in and we basically just win a piece with this little trick as it happens. So just remove the defender, destroy d4 is the plan. Now one of my opponents did actually play the one of the better moves here in this move of knight b5, which is actually a very good move for white. And if they do know this little subtlety of the move c4, sacrificing a pawn, they do actually get a big advantage here. But it's a reasonable gamble that, especially at faster time controls, your opponents are not going to find this. And instead, my opponent played the move of c3, which just allowed me to get a very good position. In fact, I'd probably say my move of a3 was actually probably not very good, because after e5, they could have played knight c4 and they could have won a pawn, which was something that both of us missed in the game. Like in the game, they kind of just blundered everything, and we're just losing a whole lot of pieces very fast. That's why I should probably go e5 first, just to avoid that whole knight c4 fork. And you can always play a6 later and go after the pawn that way if you want to. But yeah, generally you're going to be playing more in the center in these sorts of lines. But yeah, that's just showing what can happen if they play the bishop to d2. Going back a bit, if they do play bishop c4, I'm going to share with you actually a game that was kind of my inspiration for this video, because just earlier today I was playing a game against a player with FIDE rank with 200-ish. Probably is a little bit better than that, but I was playing him in a blitz game and he played the move knight e2. And basically this knight c6 I'm showing, I actually had just prepared it just earlier today as an update video for Play the Strongest Scandinavian 2025. So I was really excited to get to kind of play the ideas on the board and see how it would work against an actual opponent. My opponent played the move of f3, which is the most common move, but a move that we're actually fairly happy to see. And here's where we deviate a little bit with the setup. This is one of a little bit of the more advanced ideas in this video. So if you want to pause the video and try to guess what move black would play, then you're certainly welcome to do so. The fact that our bishop is under attack does, of course, limit the options, but put in the comments below, where do you think our bishop would go? All right, for this one here, the answer is that bishop e6 is a really great move. It looks really weird because our pawns get doubled, but we actually get really good play against the d4 pawn to compensate. Note, by the way, that d5 isn't anything to fear, because again, we have that move long castles. This is a really good move to remember. When they play d5, just castle long, go for the pin on the queen, and then you're just going to be able to take their pawn for free with a winning position. Okay, if they castle, you can even play queen c5 and, fork their queen and bishop, king and bishop, which is even better. But yeah, you can see the problems that the white is facing if they try to fork us with d5. So after takes, white castle short, we castle long. And that's one thing that makes it so fun. Like in these lines, white usually castles short. We castle on opposite sides, and castling on opposite side of the opponent is a really great way to create some dynamic chances and to play, the kind of romantic chess we love to see in videos by players like Morphy, by Alyakhin, by Fischer, Kasparov. we're playing in that kind of spirit without having needing to learn all the theory that Fischer and Kasparov had to. This is the low theory, easy way to play in that very attacking style and really put the maximum pressure on the opponent. Now, here my opponent made a mistake. They realized that we want to play the move e5 and attack the pawn on d4, just similar to what we've seen before. Well, I probably should play a move like f4 to try to stop that, as I do talk about in my course. But instead, my opponent played bishop e3, and I was able to just play the stand idea of e5, and white just has a really hard time defending this pawn properly. Because let's say if they play a move such as queen d2, for example, well, you might notice that after all of these captures, that we can now play the move of e5, and again we use that pin against the piece against the queen to simply win the bishop. So that's already just winning out the opening in just 13 moves. Now my opponent defended a little bit better than that. They played bishop f2. But again, the problem is they just can't take back on d4. We basically just won a pawn, because if knight d4, we can take obviously not queen d4, but bishop d4, e5, and again we just win the bishop, So all very standard ideas. We're often winning very pretty much the same way each time. And you can just basically beat the opponents like this over and over again. In the game, my opponent played knight e4, but at this point, I basically was just up a pawn for absolutely nothing. We've got the space, and the rest of the game was pretty one-sided. Like they just never really were able to get any counterplay, and I did go on to win the end game from here. Like I'll just show you the final moves just very briefly, just so you can see how I won. So just making sure, yeah, just to maximize the pressure on the pawn. Tried to play a bit of a safety first move, which wasn't really necessary, but it doesn't really spoil anything either. And then I found a nice little tactic of knight b4, realizing that they can't take with the pawn because then they lose the rook, and same story after take, that they can't take back, but they're also losing a third pawn here. And so my opponent just resigned at this point. So a pretty smooth game. It was one where even though I was playing blitz, I was able to play with like a very high accuracy. Like my accuracy level is so high that even if I had that level of accuracy in a classical game as a 2,500 rated GM, it would already be a pretty good quality game by my standards. The fact that I was able to play a game with almost no mistakes in a blitz speed speaks to how easy it is to make this attacking style work in your own games. It's what I really believe in. It's about making life easy for you and about difficult for the opponent. That's the kind of chess that I like to play. And I think it's a chess that you like to play as well, because it's what ultimately gets you results as quickly as possible, which is why we're here in the first place. Now, if they play knight f3, we already talked about this a little bit. Like I kind of showed the problems that can arise for white if they just develop normally. They just have a hard time, defending the pawn on d4. And we kind of talked about this a little before, but just a little bit of a revision just to show you some of the tactical ideas that again we can often just ignore the attack with d5 with our rook being on the d file, pinning the pawn to the queen. So let's look at a couple of games that my opponents played. And this next one I'm going to show you. I know I said that this is to destroy players below 2,200, but in this game I'm about to show you, I actually won against a player rate 2750 bullet on chess.com, which probably comes to about an international master level, probably about 2400-ish equivalent. And he played the move of h3, which to be fair is probably the best move here. But still, we can recycle the bishop to the knight. Just be a bit careful here. Don't take that pawn too quickly because you don't want to hang the b7 pawn like this. But we play the move castles long, and that allows us to threaten the pawn without worrying about queen f7. Now, my opponent probably had to find the move of d5. This is something I did analyze quite a bit in my course, kind of showing that this sort of position is ultimately going to be quite good for black, where you will be able to put a lot of pressure against the d5 pawn over the next moves. As you can see here, we are basically just winning a pawn. But instead my opponent played bishop e3. And so the idea is that if we take the pawn without thinking, that they go bishop f7 and the position's not so bad for white all of a sudden. But by playing the move of e5, again, I think this idea is starting to become clear to you by now. We're just able to take that initiative where after takes queen f5. So I played queen f5 because there was a little bit of a fork going on here. But after queen f5, king b8, my opponent actually had to find the move of bishop e2 just to stay in the game. After bishop b3, I actually made a bit of a mistake. I kind of lost my advantage, and I still ended up went on to win the game anyway, but I kind of played this game before I'd actually really studied this knight c6. By the time I played this game, I was basically just playing it, just making it up from move 6 pretty much. But from this, you might have figured out how to play better than I did at this point. There's actually kind of two answers. One of them, the fancy one, is to go bishop a3 and, kind of overload the defense of the b2 pawn and, just get at the white king like this. And the simplest solution is that you can just win the queen here with knight to d3, which is why the bishop needs to go to e2 to kind of cover the queen like this. But now, you do just win the queen and you just have a completely winning position. Okay, bishop a3 is even better as it turns out. But yeah, you just are up material and you have the attack. So you can see how I was basically able to get a winning position in just 12 moves against a player rate 2750 bullet, which speaks a lot to the strength of this system, because if it works against a player of that level, imagine how effective it's going to be against a player close to your own rating. And you don't even have to imagine, because I already have the games here to show you of how it's done. So in this game against one of my most common opponents on chess.com, Pablo DMP, rated 2132 bullet at the time this game, he played bishop d2 because he was trying to set up some sort of discovery on the queen, but the problem is that they're not really trapping our queen here because we're always going to have a little bit of a hidey hole. And meanwhile, we're just going to have a very strong attack against their center, like e5, and we're just, ripping the position open, just throwing everything at the white king and at the center. And there's not a lot that white can really do against this very strong attack. I mean, it's one thing to get these sort of attacking positions with white, but to get them with black is really something special. Now in the game, my opponent played d5, and there's a few decent options for the knight, but notice how they have broken the pin on the pawn to the queen, so we do need to move the knight. But the good news is that by playing knight d4, we use that pin on the knight to really limit white's options. They tried breaking the pin with bishop e2, but after takes and knight d5, black is just up a pawn for absolutely nothing here. We've also got the pin on the knight to annoy them. And after some more moves, you could argue that, okay, it's bullet, maybe I could have played it a little more precisely. But still, we can see in a position like this, we're up a pawn, their king is weak, we've got the more active pieces, and I did go on to win from this position in some more moves. Like the fact their rook is just unable to come into the game basically seals white's fate. G5 maybe was a little bit unnecessary, but I just wanted to throw the pieces at their king, just open up the lines to their king. And when you're up 2 pawns, a lot of it just comes down to swapping off the pieces. So rook g4, rook d8, and yeah, just sort of leveraging the attack on their king. And after queen d3, they just resigned after a couple more moves. Like here, they lose the queen and they lose the house. So finally, they resigned here. So with that, you can kind of see, not just how to get the winning position, but how to actually convert it into a win as well. Because that's also important for having the best results as a chess player. I mean, a metaphor I kind of like to use a lot in my videos is that, basically the opening is kind of like, the sauce we put on the vegetables to make you eat your veggies even if you don't want to. But ultimately, it's going to mean you're going to be a lot healthier and be a much better chess player as a result. But, the opening's kind of the hook to get you in. But yeah, after knight to f6, if they played bishop e3 instead, I do have a game I also played with this where I mean, my opponent was not so high rated. Their rate just 1500, but just kind of showing you the setup once again. Actually, it turns out here I actually missed a little bit of a trick. I kind of played bishop h5, which wasn't really that good of a move as it turned out. But once again, we kind of see how hard it is for white to really defend the pawn, and in the game they kind of just blunder the pawn, allowing me just to be a pawn up just from the very start of the game. And once again, e4 it gets even worse for white because now they're going to be losing a piece as well, so it just kind of compounds the problem. But yeah, after h3, it would have been better for me to play bishop f3, and it's worth pointing out that a little bit of a trick here you can do is you can also start with knight takes d4, and then kind of win back the piece later. So there are these sort of tricks as well that do exist in this opening that are worth keeping in mind. But yeah, that's kind of showing the ideas via the move order with knight c3, queen a5, with the old main line the old main line Scandinavian, but playing it with a little bit of a, dynamic twist. This knight c6 setup, by the way, if you want to know the name of it, it's known as the Reprincev variation, which, like I said, I do cover in a lot of detail in my Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025 course. So you can always check the link in the description for more details there. But I want to go even above and beyond. I actually want to show you a couple of other ways in which you can play this attacking setup. But before I do, just a couple of other games just quickly. If white plays a move like knight f3, I find that, again, this queenside development setup is just simply the strongest one when they do go for this. Like, say, if they were to castle short and we castle long, like, let's just imagine that they do play it in a somewhat better way. Like, they do play one of the better continuations just to kind of show the worst case. I mean, even here, you still have a pretty good position. Like, one idea that I show in my course that I really, really like a lot is where you go rook g8 and you just go g5, g4, and you just use that h3 pawn as a hook and just throw that g pawn at the white king. That's quite a fun way to get some good attacking chances here with black. So that's something you can also check out later on. But what if white takes the center with d4 instead? So after d4, we castle long. Again, this time we could argue that we even have a more efficient version of the Reprincev Scandinavian attack that we saw before, because we didn't need to spend a tempo on knight f6. And that means that when they play bishop e3, well, what might be another move we can play other than knight f6 in this position? What do you all think? Well, if you've been paying attention to the video, you will know that the move e5 is going to be the key. Where if they do attack our queen, like c4, we meet with queen to a5. I go a little bit deeper into this in the course. And also in the course I show like what happens after this, that black's also doing fine here. I go into a few more details, but in this game against a player rated 2225, actually someone who was a past student of mine is what I can say. I don't want to reveal their actual identity because it's their secret account, but in this game against player rated 2225 bullet, they played d5, and I was just able to get a very strong position. Basically, you could argue maybe I should even have taken and then played 95, but in the game I decided to be a bit fancy and go 95 and get this pin going for the mating idea. Now, because my opponent, was a past student of mine, and obviously, I taught them some good things. Yeah, they did manage to at least survive the opening, so they didn't just lose right at the opening. But I still got a pretty good position, and was kind of able to outplay them later from this point. Like later on, they played this G4 move that was a little premature, and I was kind of able to use the weaknesses they create on the king side to get some chances and ultimately outplay my opponent. But yeah, let's move on to final thing I'll mention. If they do play d4, you can still play the same setup here, like bishop g4, and this will work quite well. But if you do want a little bit of an alternative, if you do want to play a little bit of a gambit, I can also mention the move of e5 as a very interesting option that I have a bit of a soft spot for. The idea is that if they take the pawn, which is what most of your opponents will do, you're already actually the one with an advantage because of their king being stuck in the center. And I've had this in quite a lot of games on different servers over the years, where you just have the pin, you're threatening knight takes e5, and it's just very awkward for white to try to defend against the attack. Like in this game against a 2214 bullet player on chess.com, I just developed the pieces very quickly. Bishop e2 probably wasn't the most precise move, but even if they play better moves, we're still doing very well. And we don't really need to go crazy here. Like, we don't even have to rush to take the pawn, but we can actually go 97 and just kind of get all the pieces in the game and then take the pawn. And that's just going to give us a really strong attack. Now, the computer points out there were some improvements. Like, I missed this idea, for example, of like takes, and I missed this little tactic that would have actually just won the game very quickly. But even without playing it in the very best way, like even with missing this bishop f2 tactic, I was still able to get a pretty dominant position where, I can even just take the pawn here, for example. And I mean, I went on to win pretty comfortably from there as such. Okay, now for the second part, I want to show you another way in which you can play this attacking system. I know I could have stopped here and easily covered it in a separate video, but I like to over-deliver. I like to give a bit longer form content so that you can really get the maximum value from the training. And yeah, from there with the move knight to f6, this is also another way you can play, which actually is a move I played even more often than queen takes d5 on chess.com. And there's a lot of different ways you can kind of play, but you often can get a similar kind of attacking setup to what we just saw. So let me just show you what I mean. I'll start with the move of d4 first. And yeah, with bishop g4, this is the Portuguese. It's something I have covered in a few of my recent videos lately, showing a few different games with this idea. But I've noticed that if white doesn't sort of play the critical lines with the move pawn to f3, which, your opponent has to be a little bit brave, let's say, to go for, if they do just try to play safely, you're going to be able to get that attacking setup we just saw. But we're going to kind of get a slightly improved version of it because after, say, bishop e2 takes knight e2 and queen d5, you can kind of see here that we're not really so worried about, our queen getting kicked around as much. And also the exchange of the minor pieces does help us when we have a bit less space in the position. So if they play knight bc3, there's various squares the queen can go. But you can kind of notice that we're not limited to playing queen a5, but we can also develop the queen very actively on h5. I remember I had this bullet game against the 1600 where my opponent, like, they're already in a bad position because e5 is threatening to fork the bishop and the pawn like we saw before. But my opponent just completely put a piece on pre because they just weren't used to the queen being on h5, seeing things from afar. Okay, that one's a bit of an easy example, but what about a game I played against a 2106 rated player in chess.com bullet, where they played the move b3, I castled long, c4, queen h5. And again, we see this problem that white's having a hard time keeping their pawn safe. Because if they go d5, we just go e6 and we use that pin once again. If they play bishop b2, which is probably what they should play, well, we have a lot of different ways to attack. Like, we can even just play a solid move like e6 if we want to. Computer also shows off a bit and points out you can even play knight d4 and, temporarily sacrifice a piece, but you end up getting it back with interest because of the pin here. So that's also a pretty decent way to play it as black. In the game, my opponent blundered with knight f4, and I could just take the pawn and just be much better, but I showed off a little bit and played the move of e5 to use that pin once again. My opponent just kind of blundered more pieces, like by this point. Even though my opponent is rated 2-100, at this stage you're just down 2 pawns for absolutely nothing, and it's only move 13. And my opponent resigned a few moves later, like there wasn't all that much more to see, but at this point they kind of realized that that they're down 2 pawns and we have, the much better position, so it's just game over for white. Yeah, that was a pretty crushing win, but what if they play it with a move like queen e2 rather than knight e2? Well, after queen d5, it's funny, I've actually had a few opponents just blunder the g2 pawn on the very next move at this point in bullet, which is kind of funny. But yeah, after knight f3, there's a few ways you can play it. I had this game actually against player rate 2613 bullet on chess.com, and this was back when that was probably an international master level. Now, probably objectively, the best move is to play the move e6 first. I kind of, talk a bit about this in my course, and I also mentioned it briefly in one of my earlier videos. But the move knight c6 is also a possible alternative where, okay, you're sort of gambling a little bit that they won't play the move c4, which does actually end up being pretty good for white, and kind of why I suggested e6 in the course. But in the game, my opponent just defended the pawn without thinking, and it kind of allowed me to get some good counterplay here. I think if I had this position again, maybe I'd play queen h5, and I'd probably go for that rook g8 and g5 g4 plan that I showed before. Even without white playing the move h3, it does still give you pretty good attacking chances. So we see that even when white does get into the middle game, we still can set the opponent a lot of problems in the early middle game, which is kind of a nice worst case to have. But I played queen f5 in the game, which is still quite playable. It's just a different way to play it. That's one of the things I love about the Scandinavian, is how many different ways you can play this opening. Now, I probably should just again go e5 and just accept that the position will simplify a bit. It's equal, but it's not necessarily the same as drawn. We do still have ways to, start attacking their king with the opposite side castling. End up playing e6 in the game, which is maybe not quite as precise, but it does at least have the advantage that we are at least keeping a bit of tension in the position. I'm a bit surprised that my opponent didn't play b5, because that's kind of what I was expecting him to do. Because I do think this pawn storm does actually give white a pretty decent advantage if they play it correctly, because of me not playing the move e5 before. But my opponent didn't find the best moves here, and I kind of just went for it with g5, which is objectively not really sound. Like, I kind of wish now that I'd played a move maybe to prepare it instead. Maybe a move like either e5 again, or queen h5 to set up this little bit of a trick with bishop h2 and using the pin on the knight. But yeah, in the end, he didn't take with the bishop, but he took with the knight, which kind of allowed me to justify my play, where now I get this really strong attack down the g file. I mean, this sort of style of play, like, it's very Tal-esque, very much in styles of very dynamic players like Greco, Morphy, Tal, Alican. My opponent realized here that if they play knight f3, that after queen g4, they have a bit of a hard time defending this pawn because of the pins. And after h5, we're just going to go h4, rip open that g file, and just have a really strong attack on the white king here. And it's already going to be very tough, actually, for white to survive, even according to the computer. So my opponent played f4, and this one kind of makes a good little puzzle, in case you do want to try and find the move that black played. If you want to see if you found my move, you can put it in the comments below and then compare it with, what you see here in the video just now. And I kind of forgot to mention this before, but if you do need more time, you can always pause if you need more time to think about it. But okay, I was playing bullets and I realized here that the move of knight d5 is very strong, as it doesn't just attack the pawn, but it also kind of stops them developing their knight. So it's a move that kind of has both, both has a threat, but also stops white doing what they want to do at the same time. My opponent played g3, trying to keep everything defended, but the problem with that is that after knight takes e3 and bishop takes f4, we use the pin on the pawn to take back the pawn with interest. And after queen f2, I found a very nice little tactic to end the game in my favor. I realized I can actually play a very beautiful finishing sack of bishop takes g3, and then after queen h3, they just don't really have a way to defend their king properly, because if they play knight h2, as in the game, we just take. And they might appear safe for the moment, but after rook d8, there just isn't a good defense to rook g2, and just going for the checkmate. After knight d2, rook g2, queen f4, very nice finishing move to end the game here. In the move of rook h g3, and the only way to avoid the checkmate is basically to sack the queen. And white resigned because if knight f3, we just go here and we give checkmate like this with queen to g2, which would have been a very beautiful way to finish the game with all these sacrifices. So yeah, you can kind of see how with this system with bishop g4, we're playing a bit of an opening gambit. I did mention before in a past video, this is my favorite gambit against 1e4, and here we're kind of seeing a few different ways of how to kind of punish the opponent's most common mistakes based on my own experience. So if they play knight f3, you'll notice that it's kind of a little bit similar to the position that we saw beforehand, actually. But the difference is that we haven't played the move queen a5. Instead, we have a bit more flexibility in terms of where the queen can go. So it does give us a bit of a better version there. Now, the main move I have is the move of c3. This is a move that is probably not the best move for white, but is one that I did face a fair bit in my own games. There's kind of a couple of different ways you can play it. Like, you can either go long castles or you can play e5. And I'll show you both of them just so you can kind of make your own choice. But I think the move long castling is maybe the most flexible one, just kind of keeping this a bit in reserve. And also, if they do castle, you also have other ideas, like, for example, like e5 is kind of standard, but there's also moves like h5 where you can, kind of use the h pawn or, use the g pawn to try to get an attack. So the pawn storm is also a legitimate approach here when they castle. But in this game, my opponent with a bullet rating of 2352. Actually, looking at it might even be a blitz rating. Yeah, it might even be a blitz game, but in this game, my opponent played bishop e3, and as you might expect by now, I played the move e5. And here my opponent just made a big blunder. Worth pointing out, by the way, that if they do play d5, that, again, we have this little trick of knight e5 that, we use the pin just to have a really big advantage, because the d3 square does beckon as a juicy outpost for our knight here. If white does play a move such as castles, we have a lot of ways to play it, but I kind of like the move of e4, and just kind of sets us up really well to go for an attack on the white king, because we do have the space around the king to make that kind of attack work. But my opponent blundered with knight takes e5, and he only realized too late that his intended move of takes will run in a queen d1 and this checkmate like we see here. If bishop d4, we do a little bit of a elastic band with knight takes to just be up a piece. And finally, he played the move f3 in the game, which ended up playing the move knight c4 in response, where even though we do give up the piece, we kind of make the point that with this pin on the e file, that the white king is going to be in a very rough spot. In fact, they probably already have to play a very ugly king d2 move just to not lose material from this point. But that's clearly not going to be playable for white. To have the king on d2 and no development in such a wide open position is just not on. Unfortunately for white, after queen f3, it turns out that actually I kind of misplayed this bit. I should have played the move of queen d3, and that would have actually won the bishop because of this king f2 and rook e3, and this would have been a nice tactic to win the game. And it's one thing that's fun about this system. Like, it's not just going to win you a lot of games, but with all the different tactics you can get early in the game, it's actually going to make you a much stronger tactical player and give that really strong combinational and dynamic vision. Just going to basically teach you how to attack and how to win with tactics. I played Queen e6, which does give white a second chance to keep the game going with King d2. But in the game, they just blundered into the fork and they did just resign from this position. So yeah, that was a fun little example. You can also play the move of e5 immediately here. And if they play d takes e5, yeah, there's various ways that you can play it. I mean, the way that I played in the game with this, I'm maybe not so keen on. Like maybe I would just play bishop f3 and just accept that an endgame like this is going to be about equal. We also have the dynamism on the against g2 to kind of make up for our worst structure, but it is a slightly dry position, which is why I probably would lean towards recommending long castles here, as maybe the move more in the spirit of our opening. But anyway, those are kind of the ideas with bishop g4 I want to share, just showing you how you can play our attacking setup against the more common defensive knight f3 and bishop e2 you're most likely to face below the 200 level. And I will say that a lot of my inspiration for this, from let's say, 15, 20 years so did come from my friend Blair Manlow, who would play the system quite a lot. And he actually used it, like, even though it was rated like in the 2000s to 100 FIDE. I think it was, yeah, around 2000s FIDE. But he had like this 5 minute rating of like 2500 plus, like even nearly 2600 at one point on ICC back in the Internet Chess Club. And that was basically by playing these ideas I'm showing here with this bishop g4 and going for that attacking setup of queen d5, knight 6, long castles e5. He didn't know a whole lot of theory, but didn't really need to because it's kind of just the same moves most of the time. Now, if they play something like knight c3, you can just play knight takes d5, and I've faced the move knight c3 quite a lot in my own games, where you can still go for the same general setup. There might be some modifications, but the same thing will tend to work well. For example, I know that below 200, a lot of my opponents would play this dubious knight takes d5 exchange, just letting me get the queen to a more active square. And then we kind of get an improved version of 2 queen takes d5, as I also talk about it a bit in my course, because you're not worried about knight c3 anymore. And, with knight f3, we just go bishop g4, bishop e2, knight c6. And, again, if they go d4, we just get that standard pressure on the pawn with all the pieces, just like we see here, like just every single queenside developed piece being in some way involved in the attack on d4. In the game, my opponents played a little bit more passively. There was a game where I was playing against a guy with a rating of 2366 bullets on chess.com who played this move of d3, which is a little bit passive rather than putting a pawn on d4 like we've seen before. Because now we just get the space advantage in the center. After bishop e3, I probably wish I'd played the move f6 and just gone for the pawn storm. I feel like that's really going to be the most effective plan to just attack white's king from here. At the time I played this game, I was maybe not in the best form, because bishop e7 is a bit of a mistake, and I should have just played f6. So I'll kind of skip ahead past this game, because wasn't really happy with how I played it. But there is one other idea I want to show you. So after h3, you might be wondering, well, if they put the question to the bishop, what should we do in response? And if you're playing against a player you respect, like quite an advanced player, I'd probably recommend just going bishop f5 and just kind of going for the sort of English attack style pawn storm, where you kind of use h3 as a hook. That's probably the way I'd play it today, but I did also have a game where I played the move h5. Actually, had quite a few games where I played the move h5. I have noticed that while it's objectively not the best move, it's one that's a bit hard for the opponent to deal with. And kind of the idea of this fishing pole style attack is that it's actually a mistake for them to take the bishop, which is what most of my opponents were doing. Obviously, if you're able to swing the queen h5, that would be great, but you do have to be a little bit careful because queen h5 does run into bishop g4 with the check and the fork on the queen and king. So you don't want to fall into that, obviously. But instead, I played the move f5 in this game, and my opponent kind of just blundered and just sort of ran into a checkmate here, as you can see. It turns out, actually, looking at now, that in fact the move e6 is even a little bit of an improvement over how I played in the game, because it turns queen h5 into a very real checkmating threat. So it kind of forced them to take the pawn, but then we kind of get a very strong attack with the bishop. That, for example, if they go knight f3, we can play like queen e4, and even though we're down a piece, it actually turns out it's very hard to get out of rook h3. That if, say, king h1, queen f5, we kind of just throw everything at the the white king, and it's just really hard for them to keep the extra piece. Like if they go f3, for example, they're actually getting mated after queen f4 to give an idea of just how bad this can get for white after natural moves. And otherwise, it's sort of hard to know how else to defend, because if bishop d3, you've got moves like knight d4. You can kind of like, go takes and sort of bring the pieces in the attack. The rooks can even just double up more gradually. So it's maybe a little bit of a computerish idea, this one. Like f5 maybe is the more human move, because you have a bit of an easier way to kind of get at the white knight from there. But yeah, it turns out you actually have a lot of good ways to play this attack, believe it or not, which is something that was a bit of news to me as well, in fact. Just to kind of round this off with a few other ideas, if they play knight f3 instead, I mean, the way I'd like to play it on chess.com is rather than playing the usual moves like, queen takes d5 or knight takes d5 or whatever. I mean, you can still play this way if you want to, although I do think it's a little bit nebulous. But you can still go for this kind of stuff if you really don't trust your opponent's defensive ability, which, if you think about it, it's kind of the main weakness of players below 200s. They're just not very good at defending. And this sort of, this system I'm showing you kind of exploits that to the maximum. But I also think the move bishop g4 is a very interesting idea where you just kind of play a Portuguese anyway. It turns out if they do know some subtleties like bishop b5, they do get a bit of an advantage. This is something that I'm very open about in my course as well, by the way, where I do go into a fair bit of detail of how these positions play out. But in the game, white played bishop e2. I played queen takes d5, so it's kind of like similar territory to what we just saw before. And I also had a game against a player rated 2037 bullets, where after knight h3, I played this queen h5 move, which honestly I don't think is all that good. Because I had some games on chess.com where I was kind of playing this sort of piece sack as a way to kind of get some attacking chances, but I have to admit it's not really sound if white plays correctly. Like if they do bring the bishop to the defense, it's kind of hard to really say that this is going to be playable. So rather than the move of queen h5 I played in the game, like even though it worked amazingly in the game and I was able to, get the attack on the pawn and even actually win a piece because I just didn't see the pin on the pawn. So it was successful in the game perhaps, but as it happens, yeah, I would probably recommend if you do have this position again, just put the queen on either d7 is kind of the solid option where you're still going to play for castles and e5 later, or possibly e6. Or if you do want to play it more dynamically, you can also play like queen to f5. But it is true that h3 does prove to be a little bit annoying in that case, which is kind of why I was saying the move of queen d7 is my main recommendation. But if you do want something a little bit dynamic and imbalanced, this is a possible alternative to put the queen on f5. And if your opponent doesn't notice the salty, then you're probably just going to get a very good position out of the opening with some similar ideas to what we've seen before. Yeah, so just to kind of conclude, I'll just show you one final way in which you can play this setup of destroying players below 200 before I conclude the video. It turns out you're actually not limited to playing it via a d5 move order like we just saw, but you can also even play it via a Nimzovich move order with knight c6. And obviously this is not a complete repertoire, like there are other moves that they can play at different points. But if they play d4 and you go d5, and it's also the way that I kind of remember that Vladimir Smirnov actually, that I am in Australia, and the father of Anton Smirnov. Basically, this is the way he liked to play it in online games. Like he was also playing a lot on ICC, and he got a blitz rating of like 2800 plus, like not even really knowing any theory, but just kind of going for this setup all the time and just going for the attack on the d4 pawn, just very systematic. And if white does play knight c3, then I like the move of queen h5, just lining up the attack on the knight like this. And if d5 again, you can sort of go long castles and just really make it quite hard for white to defend their pawn on d5 as such. Now, in this game against a 2075 rated bullet player, the game went bishop e2, castles d5. And again, I played this move of e6, just making it very hard for white to save the pawn. And at this point, white kind of has to find the move of knight g5 just to not end up in a really bad position. The idea is that they do have the attack with knight f7, which kind of allows them to sort of stay afloat here, even though black does still have a pretty decent position. Like white can't really hang on to the extra pawn forever, so it does kind of peter out to equality if they do find this move. But keep in mind that a 2075 rated player did not find knight g5 in the game. And if they don't find it, the position just is kind of bad for white, where after bishop to d2, I just took the pawn. I was basically a pawn up for absolutely nothing. And I went on just to kind of consolidate, just bring the pieces very actively. I was probably like half pre-moving. That's my explanation for why I didn't play this move right away. But I did see knight d4 on the second opportunity, and was able to win the end game and just win pretty comfortably from here. Like the rest was just not just make sure not to allow anything silly, and just letting good exchanges happen. And I mean, my technique probably wasn't absolutely the best, but like once I won the second pawn, the rest was pretty easy to convert. And after a few more moves of not too great an importance, my opponent did ultimately lose on time. So yeah, that was the final game I wanted to show you. Like obviously, it is true if you play the one d5 move order, you're a lot more likely to get that attacking setup on the board because they do have moves like e5 or knight c3 as alternatives. But if they do play a move like knight f3, you can go d5, and you can definitely go for a very similar kind of attacking setup here with bishop g4, castles, and e5. Something like this is actually not all that terrible for black. I mean, to be fair, if they do know the bishop g5 salty, they do get some advantage, but there's always a trade-off when you play these sort of tricky systems with black. But yeah, that's just to summarize basically the sort of the three different ways to play this attacking setup. Just remember, this kind of thing, and you're pretty much set. Just of developing the queenside pieces as actively as possible. And you can play it either in the Reprintsev style with queen a5 and, doing it this way. That's the first way to do it. The second way is to play it in the Portuguese style with knight f6, bishop g4, and, kind of playing it like I'll use knight for example, kind of playing it like this sort of way with this kind of attack. Or if you're really feeling creative, you can also play it via the knight c6 and d5 move order and get it in like this as such. So yeah, those are the three options. I wish you the luck with playing it in your own games. Though to be fair, given how effective it is for destroying players below 200, you're not really going to need the luck, but wishing it anyway, just to be nice. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what was a part of this video that you really loved. By getting your feedback, by getting the likes or comments, it allows me to tailor the subsequent content and tell me, okay, you want more of this or such. So yeah, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this system, and if you are sort of intrigued by what I've shared here and you want to take your understanding of these ideas and your applications from having a decent feel for the positions to really mastering and just knowing you never have to fear the move e4 ever again, then do make sure to check out my course in the description below. Play the Strongest Scandinavian in 2025. It is currently on a discount price, but that price will expire on March the 12th, 2025. So if you are kind of, thinking about it, I would recommend getting in before the price goes up. But yeah, you're really, really going to love it. And yeah, on that note, good luck with playing the Scandinavian and this very strong attacking setup in your own games, and see you in the next one. Take care.